Ultimate Panel, Reflections on Life and Literature. We are here to celebrate the careers and retirements of Skip Fox, Marianne Wilson, Jerry McGuire, and Steve Devine. Before I begin, our department head has a few words.
I don't need the microphone because it keeps going in and out.
Okay.
That's Fleetwood Mac. That's what I'm calling it.
I'll be brief, but it's appropriate with occasions like that to start off with a quotation. And I picked one from Quintilian, whose Institutio Oratoria shaped study and teaching of the humanities for the last 2,000 years, and included a discussion of study in retirement. So just a short quote from that. Before ever he fall a prey to the ambush where time lies in wait for him, the orator should sound the retreat and seek harbor while his ship is yet intact. For the fruits of his studies will not be lessened by retirement. Now, I'm not saying that any of these ships have started to leak. And it is a sad celebration, particularly for me, because in 2 weeks when their retirement is official, I'll be the oldest old fart among the English faculty, graduate faculty in our department. Skip, all four of these professors were honored as UL Foundation Distinguished Professors. Skip came here in 1981, Marianne in 1986, Jerry in 1995, Christine in 2001. A total of 109 years in this department, over a century. I didn't calculate how many centuries of teaching and research they did before they came to UL. But they have really led and shaped this department when you consider the areas that they've covered as teachers and scholars and writers: American literature, 19th and 20th century, creative writing, Victorian literature, theory and poetics, film, fiction, Southern literature. And you can see they have at least 15 books which we have on display here. Details about them that may come out, about their careers may come out in the discussion, and you certainly can find it in the publication we have for this. So I'm just going to tell you what we're doing. We'll start out with they each get 10 minutes to talk about whatever they want to talk about. This is a variation of the last lecture. We're calling it the Ultimate Panel. Okay? And those always take different forms. Some get very biographical and take us through their careers, and others kind of do an overview of the profession, what they think is important in their research. And basically, some of the panel wants to do kind of one, and some of the panel wants to do kind of another. And we'll see what happens when we get into discussion, and you'll be invited to take part in that with your questions and comments as well. So starting with Skip, looking back over your career and forward to retirement, what are your thoughts?
I guess I'd sort of like to focus on a very simplistic way of looking at what I've been up to for the past 37 years and longer. A lot of people, I think, that could look at my career and think that it's split into two parts, bibliography and research and creative writing. And if you look at what was produced during those times, that sort of supports that. But coming up with something that Diana was saying, I don't see literature and creative writing as mutually exclusive, or not as much as one would normally conceive. So I'd like to start off with just a simple sort of summary of what I've been up to for 37 years, and then talk about how perhaps literature and creative writing are blended in my work. I dedicated my life to poetry in 1969 when I was running around the country and basically homeless, living at a Elwha campsite on Olympic National Park. And somebody gave me a book during that period, Donald Allen's New American Poetry, a wonderful anthology breaking up all of experimental American poetry into 6 basic categories: the Beats, Black Mountains, San Francisco Renaissance, and so forth. And within 3 weeks of that, when he gave me that book, I knew what I was about. I was about 23 years old. I'd been sort of a slacker going from one thing to another, and all of a sudden I could just feel my arrow pointed directly toward literature, and began writing seriously at that point. And wrote from then for the next, well, I've been writing still, but wrote for the next 20 years, largely without any effect, hardly anything published. But I built a large library. I considered myself a dedicated writer the whole time, spent a lot of time doing it, except for about a 6-year period, which I'll mention in a moment. In the middle of the 1970s, I went back to school to finish my bachelor degree, basically because I wanted to read more literature. I wanted to have sort of a directed reading in literature. And at the end of my bachelor's, I still didn't feel I had that. One never sort of gets that, I don't think. So I went to graduate school. At the beginning of graduate school, I said, I'm going to do my graduate study as long as it doesn't interfere with my writing. That's how dedicated I was to writing. At the end of graduate school, I was saying exactly the opposite. I'll do my writing as long as it doesn't interfere with my studies. And that began about a 6-year period of, I still considered myself a strong writer and collected a lot of books and read voraciously, and yet didn't produce very much. In the middle of my time, and I do want to mention this man's name, at Bowling Green State University, I started working for James L. Harner on the Festschriften section of the MLA bibliography as an indexer. And he trained me as an indexer in his own research methods class and elsewhere. Ended up working for the MLA bibliography for about 14 years as an indexer, subsection head. And he asked me in the middle of that period to become the section head. And that was one of the 2 times I've had to say no to somebody, and really felt bad for doing so, but felt my life going in a different direction, basically. But he got me working on MLA bibliography, as well as helped me get my first book contract for a bibliography of 3 contemporary American poets. When I came here, I came working on MLA bibliography and working on my own bibliography. We'd get graduate students working on as sub-indexers, or I can't remember what we called them, on the bibliography. And sort of increased the department's publication rate significantly in the 1980s. And then I started working as book review editor for Bulletin of Bibliography for about 6 years too. Those all blending in together. In the early 1990s, I began publishing much more poetry than even though I was overlapping with book review editor for Bulletin of Bibliography. I started publishing a lot of multi-genre, and have published a number of texts, multi-genre texts, as well as selected poems, a novel, and a couple other books. It's not worth talking too much about them. And I plan to keep writing. In fact, I have a book of short fiction just finished, and 2 multi-genre works in progress. I plan to keep working. Mary Ann's going to kick me under the table if I was on that side. I plan to keep working until I'm too demented to turn on the computer. She says, don't make those jokes about senility. Somebody's got to. But my first love in academia has not disappeared. I just finished doing with a graduate student, Kimberly Southwick Thompson, and I wrote an index, a very disciplined academic index to all the motifs, figures, and metaphors in that would be something, in Sylvia Plath's short 200-page collected poems. And I'm sure that it's going to be picked up by a major Plath website because it's useful for anybody from a high school student up to a professional that wants to study or write about Plath. So they're not really broken up. I mean, I was always interested in writing when I was doing bibliography. And the impetus for doing bibliography came out of 1969, that love of literature, which I wrote down was in this just simplistic, but the most humanly, artistically, emotionally, intellectually compelling activity that I can consider, that I know of which I have access. I'm sure music and art are equally compelling, but I am barred from those terrains. And not really, but barred from sensible community from those domains. And so I see the two halves more of a piece in retrospect. Often in the mornings I'll wake up and write for a couple hours, and one of my questions often is, when did that writing turn into this reading? Or when did this reading turn into that writing? Because it is just sort of a backwards internal flow. The impetus for much of my bibliographical work came directly out of love of literature. The first book that I wrote was on 3 contemporary American poets. It's a secondary annotated bibliography, 550 pages, 10 languages, Romanian, Japanese, which is a delight to do. It took me 14 years to do, cost $14,000 to do it. I got $4,000 back on a summer sabbatical and a travel to collections grant. My last, I'm sorry, royalties. And my last royalty check from G.K. Hall said I owed them $5. Somebody had the book on consignment in some library. So, but it was such a great love doing that, and I thought that my poets, it was almost like a political act. I thought that my poets, Robert Creeley, Edward Thorne, and Robert Duncan, deserved as good a bibliography as Robert Lowell or Robert Frost or any of the other poets. So it was an act of love, and plus I got to know them. I got to know a bunch of different libraries, rare book rooms, et cetera, et cetera. This is a rather clunky metaphor, but I think it brings together that thing Diana was talking about, that these are not mutually exclusive activities, literature and art, or at least not as exclusive as we normally consider them. This is one of the examples I give to my poets often, clunky metaphor, like I said. It's as though poetry is a long umbilicus, and the earlier writers are putting nutrients into that umbilicus, and we soak all out of it what we can or what we want, and we in turn are putting other things into that umbilicus, perhaps feeding some life form that doesn't exist yet. I know I'm talking really in those kind of terms that probably disturb some people. Yeah. That's good. John Cage comes to visit. But that's the metaphor I keep reaching for, basically. One of the questions I always ask my students, I'm going to quit with this, is my basic question for literature is, and I know it's a very unprofessorial question, is how was it for you? How was it for you, Franz Kafka? How was it for you, Emily Dickinson? How was it for you, Marquis de Sade? I guess I don't want to go there. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that one of the most essential questions that we have. Maybe the question that we'll ask on our deathbed if we're still cognizant. Sorry. No, that wasn't all the way. That was just halfway. How was it for you? I mean, how was it? That's it.
Okay, enough of those jokes. Let me just start by saying what an amazing and wonderful career I've had here for the last 32 years. a career that I could in no way have anticipated, but that I'm very grateful for. My students and my generous colleagues have challenged me, helped me with my research, given me ideas and connections, and everybody's career is always, I think, an accumulation of all the people who have nurtured and fostered that career. Living in South Louisiana has given me access to areas of research that I might not otherwise have explored, everything from Kate Chopin to Rebecca Wells to Duck Dynasty, God help me. Huh? But I thought you might be interested in knowing how I got here before I begin my post-retirement unfootnoted life, which I'm very much looking forward to. So this little talk is called Beyond the Ivory Tower, Women's Studies and Women's Lives. Is my mic okay? When I was a young mother with 2 sons not yet school age, we were living in Atlanta, where my husband had a tenure-track job in the English department at Georgia State University. We met in graduate school at LSU at the party given for fellowship recipients with the same National Defense Fellowship that gave us both virtually a free ride for the time it took to get our degrees. That was a really magic golden time that quickly ended. But making the choice many women did in those days, I got married after finishing all the coursework for the PhD, taught as an instructor for a year, got pregnant, and followed my husband to his first job in Atlanta. I saw myself perhaps teaching part-time, raising a family, and being content. But I got restless. When Jim would come home from his day of teaching and tell me about the interesting lecture he had heard that day, or the fascinating classroom discussion he and his students had had, or the invitation he'd gotten to speak at a prestigious literary conference, there was a twinge of resentment I couldn't hide or erase. We had had the same fellowship, after all, and I made choices I didn't regret, but they were choices with consequences I couldn't foresee. Ever supportive, my husband encouraged me to write to LSU and arranged to take my PhD exams at some date in the future. I did this, passed them, and promptly got pregnant again. Too relaxed. I guess it was that immense sense of relief I felt at having jumped that hurdle. Now with 2 children under the ages of 5, I managed to write a dissertation in the next year and a half, defend it, and get my degree. Georgia State University hired me part-time, my teaching schedule mostly at night, so that we could avoid childcare. It was a difficult and stressful time. It was the late 1970s. America was riding the second wave of feminism. Women were demanding equal pay for equal work. What a revolutionary idea that was, and it's still not fulfilled. But I existed on the fringes of all that activity, struggling to maintain my sanity, take care of my children, husband, and students, grateful to be teaching at a good public university with several graduate programs. I couldn't understand the feminist uproar. I thought those women were too loud and strident and not part of my life. From time to time, I thought I should join some women's group or at least get to know the women in my neighborhood. So one night, I answered the invitation I'd gotten in the mail for a women's get-together and dutifully showed up, smiling and eager to assimilate. It quickly became clear after conversation began that none of these suburban women worked. And when I told them I taught English at Georgia State University, they looked at me as if I were a strange specimen who clearly wouldn't enjoy making the macrame owls the hostess had planned for the evening. They were right. And I wasn't good at it anyway. Shortly after that night, I happened to overhear a conversation between the head of my department and the graduate director, both men in their early 60s. They were discussing a recent phone call the graduate director had gotten from a prospective student. "Who was that on the phone?" Dr. X asked. "Oh," the graduate director replied, "one of those married women with children who wants to come back to school." The comment stung because they could have been talking about me. Admittedly, I had my degree and a part-time job, but that was me a few years earlier. The tone of disdain and total lack of compassion or understanding stayed with me, and it's obviously still part of my psyche since the incident sprang to mind as I was thinking about giving this talk. In retrospect, I believe this was the beginning of what women's studies scholars call a feminist consciousness, though at the time I would have rejected the term, as many women still do today. Even though I was raised in a conservative Catholic family and my parents were the children of Sicilian immigrants, I had strong female role models in my mother and grandmother who both worked side by side with their husbands in mom and pop grocery stores in the Deep South. In true European fashion, their houses were attached to their businesses, a kind of on-site daycare, blessedly practical and simple. Neither of my parents went to college, though they always encouraged my sister and me, giving us piano lessons, sending us to private schools. It was a real American success story, as I, a third-generation Italian, reaped the rewards of their sacrifice. My parents were happy and pleased when I got my PhD, but there was never any doubt in my family where a woman's primary loyalty should lie, and those were with her husband and children. And truthfully, I felt the same way, and I still do. So in those early years of the women's movement, I can remember wondering where I fit in this world that was obviously changing for so many women, at least on the surface. I wasn't ready to commit myself to a full-time tenure-track job, and I wasn't talented enough to make the arts and crafts that were booming during that period. But I wanted to be taken seriously as a professional. I wanted my work to matter. Credentialed but confused, I could foresee the struggle it would be to change the minds of Professor X and the graduate director. But I read books, found a group of women academics at my university who were juggling the same demands I was, and watched women's lives change. Eventually, of course, I got the tenure-track job after my sons were in school. We became a two-professor family. I began to read papers at conferences, go to those interesting lectures I had once envied my husband for, and build a resume. Now I have two grown sons who have also become university professors. You and Dad enjoyed what you did so much, they tell me when we talk about their choice of vocation, and you always had time for us. A statement which takes me back to those days of teaching night classes and commuting to downtown Atlanta with two crying children in the back seat, meeting my husband in the parking lot where he would take the wheel and drive them back home, leaving me to teach my classes and ride home with a student because we had only one car. And that car was a blue Volkswagen Jetta that was always overheating. You do what you have to do at certain times in your life, I tell my students. The Siren Song of Louisiana eventually lured us back from Atlanta, and I have been in Lafayette and at UL for 32 years. I now teach in a predominantly female department led by women. I've been lucky enough to teach not only American literature and Southern women writers, but the Introduction to Women's Studies course, which revisits all the challenges and promises of that early women's movement. Most of my women students know nothing about the history which made it possible for them to attend the university, to vote, to choose not to marry and still be viewed as a whole person. My daughters-in-law balance their professional and personal lives beautifully with the help of their enlightened husbands. Time and again, as I relate my own life to the courses I teach, I'm struck by how the intellectual perspectives that became central to women's studies as a discipline were created from the everyday experiences of women like me. Women realized and continue to realize through these courses that they're not alone. Problems they thought were personal, like working outside the home all day and then coming home to work another full day, taking care of the domestic jobs involved with being a wife and mother, are actually part of the bigger picture. My point in telling this story is to emphasize how the fight for women's rights and dignity began at home, in the nursery, in the kitchen, in the loneliness, frustration, and sometimes anger in the private lives of women. The personal and the political continue to inform each other in the lives of the young women I teach. Just this week, I listened to each student in my women's studies class articulate how she imagined her feminist future. They were amazing. I was amazed at how clear-sighted, confident, and focused they were, as I was not at their age. As I look back on my career here at UL, I'm happy to think I've made a difference in the lives of my students, whether they're freshman honors students, teachers in summer LEH classes, which have since fallen by the wayside, of course, not funded any longer, graduate students, study abroad scholars, or friends of the humanities in our Wednesday night sessions. I anticipate moving back to Georgia, to a lovely college town with a statue of the Marquis de Lafayette in the town square. Think about that, huh? I want to investigate what he was doing there. But I'll bring this Louisiana joie de vivre with me. And I've already contacted the president of the college about getting involved there. He knows I'm coming.
Jerry.
Well, I found out just this afternoon that New Belgium Beer has put out a hemp-flavored beer. My work here is truly done. I have some quotations that I wanted to read, and the first one is from a book that everybody who's going to retire, which means everybody, should read. It's by Edward Said, and it's called On Late Style. It's writing about it's a great book to read if you want to be compared to Beethoven, Mozart, people like that. He's writing about what people produce late in their career, Thomas Mann, Beethoven, etc. And he writes, Beethoven's late works remain unreconciled, unco-opted by a higher synthesis. They do not fit any scheme, and they cannot be reconciled or resolved, since their irresolution and unsynthesized fragmentariness are constitutive, neither ornamental nor symbolic of something else. Beethoven's late compositions are in fact about lost totality and are therefore catastrophic. That's the way I like to think of myself as well. I have I'm getting ready to retire, and I'm thinking of different thoughts and feeling different feelings, the way it is when you're an adolescent. And so they are all fragmentary, and they're not resolved. But I thought I'd kind of cram some of them together today, and so I beg your indulgence because I do need to read them. I'm calling it 5 Quotes, a Dream, and a Poem. Because that's what it is, 5 quotes, a dream, and a poem. And I read you one quote from Edward Said, and the other one I want to match Jim's quintillion quote with one from Dickie Betts, the second best guitarist in the Allman Brothers band, about his retirement. He says it's a little bit of burnout, a little sour grapes, a little bit like a boxer who gives it up. It's pretty rough, to tell you the truth. Everyone wishes they could be young forever. But I feel like I did my work, and I'm not going to do anything that's going to top what I'm known for. So why don't you just stay home? Quotation 2 is from Rousseau, from the I always wanted to do a paper where I quoted Dickey Betts and Rousseau. From the Reveries of a Solitary Walker. I live here as in some strange planet to which I've fallen from the one I knew. And then he says, their philosophy is meant for others. I need one for myself. Let me seek it for myself while there is still time. I am now in the prime of life and the fullness of my mental powers. I am about to enter my decline. If I wait any longer, I shall no longer have all my powers to devote to my tardy deliberations. Let me seize on this auspicious moment. It is the time of my outward and material reformation. Let it also be the time of my intellectual and moral reformation. Let me decide my opinions and principles once and for all, and then let me remain for the rest of my life what mature consideration tells me I should be. Which he wisely follows by, it is true, no doubt, that the prejudices of childhood and the secret wishes of my heart tipped the scales on the side which was most comforting to me. Here's another quote from my teacher, Robert Creeley. He's famous for saying that form is never more than an extension of content. And then my last quote comes from Freud. I was in a graduate exam the other day, and this happened to be written on my coffee cup, so that puts to mind. But I looked it up. It's in the Interpretation of Dreams. He says, when the work of interpretation has been completed, we perceive that a dream is the fulfillment of a wish. So what I want to suggest is a mashup of these two last ideas. I think Creeley's idea that form is never more than an extension of content, and Freud's idea that a dream is the fulfillment of a wish. I think that the idea of a form that assembles content into an extension is the very model of dream. Think of Freud's note on what he calls the dream's navel, which I'm only quoting because that's the most beautiful thing Freud ever wrote. This is the dream's navel, and the place beneath which lies the unknown. Out of a denser patch in this tissue, the dream wish then arises like a mushroom from its mycelium. The dream wish is a form submitted to extension. The mycelium is substantial content, but unobservable. So all I'm going to say about myself or about the subject that's dominated my life is that one's life is constituted by the symbols generated by that life. And this turning of a life into symbols, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, is our lifelong act of extension. And thus the very central fact of our life is a kind of dream. When you work through that, go ahead, figure it out. I'm going to tell you a dream and read you a poem, and then I intend to respect the words of Dickey Betts and go home and stay there. Here's the dream. I'm walking across in front of a front row of sitting people. It's an outdoor concert of some sort, but a kind of polite and orderly one. A little girl mischievously reaches up and grabs me by my coat because, yes, I'm wearing a long, fairly heavy coat at an outdoor concert, though everyone else seems perfectly comfortable in shirts, skirts, even shorts. I immediately recognize the little girl. She's Mimi's daughter. The same fresh eyes, soft freckles, touching smile. And the man beside her, her father, says, "Do you recognize them?" Because she has a sister right there, too. And I say, "Yes, of course, I recognized her at once." In my dream, I thought, she stands before me as a living child. That line of William Butler Yeats is unbearably beautiful and at the same time extremely creepy, is what I woke up to. But there was a little more, a kind of reverie between sleep and waking, in which I tossed around in my head confused ideas about lost connections, about love, about desire. Because that child was only a child, and with my cousin Mimi's face. And I was an old guy in a suit, leaving, as it seems, the concert of everyone, which was now morphing into a concerted sort of family gathering, too. And not to give too much away, but somehow, on my father's front porch, I briefly glimpsed Mimi again and rocked her child in my lap. Did I say that I was weeping? Who or what was Mimi? Only belatedly do I see her name for what only now it becomes. Me. Me. I knew her briefly when we were children. I was the hick from the country whose father worked in a mill. She lived in the suburbs of Poughkeepsie, where her father worked at IBM. The connection was my oldest brother, a hail fellow well met named Jim and nicknamed Squire, who smoked like a freight train and drank like Nick and Nora Charles. Look it up, kids. Marion and Rink, Mimi's parents, were just like Jim, only thinner, richer, and more remote, and so more fascinating. As they all sat around under their late 1950s cloud of booze and smoke, Mimi and I would wander our separate ways, pretty much oblivious of each other. And then one day, it was as if she discovered me. ... You must be wondering where this is going. That, as comedian Stephen Wright has said, is how I feel all the time. But if we simply snap forward 55 years, I'm in Lafayette, writing a poem in which I embed the story of the day Mimi discovered me, after which, I believe, we never saw each other again. Here's the poem. But first, I have to tell you, it has a line in it. Don't get this wrong. My cousin taught me sex in a game of stretch. And I think I should explain that. I should, for comic relief, call Diana to play a game of stretch up here right now, but it can't be played properly indoors. Stretch is a game played with a knife and with bodies. And to be done right, it has to be played on my father's green lawn on a summer's day in 1959. And you need to be 12 years old. Not 10, certainly. And definitely not 16. One would be absurd and the other obscene. What you do is stand facing your opponent, who becomes your partner if all goes properly, and one of you has a knife, say the jackknife your father gave you and told you always to carry in case you need to cut anything. The one with the knife throws the knife at the ground. If it sticks, the other person, moving only one leg, stretches to place her foot where the knife landed. Then she throws the knife at the ground, and if it sticks, the first thrower, moving only one leg, must stretch to step on that place. The object is to throw the knife so that it sticks somewhere one's opponent can't stretch to reach. But in practice, the two people playing wind up stretching over one another's bodies to reach the knife, winding up in a kind of tangle as they both stretched there on my father's green lawn in 1959. So here's the poem. Of Ring Around Rosie and other slim habitudes, not much luck, but can make those smacking noises. The midwife calls it playing the vibes. Anterior, polite abominations, that's my baby. She was awful, I mean a shellacking, no rust on her ceilings in the vernacular. We was playing underground and the bugs just ate us up. More sloppy than marsupials, less plodding than the Lepidoptera. London Bridge fell down, Red Rover came over. My cousin taught me sex in a game, our cover, of stretch, and never knew it, maybe. My hooligan frères were practicing their chug-a-lugs So she, the knife, and I enjoyed these interludes, just strange enough to build a theory on. The flesh is cool, cuz let's don't ever get connubial. And here's the magical conclusion to this story. Some months later, Marion and Rink came up and visited my brother, but Mimi couldn't come. I felt some disturbance in the force, but experienced it just as mild disappointment, until Marion let out that Mimi, my pretty cousin Mimi, was sore distressed and wept horribly when she learned she couldn't come. At that moment, dunce that I was, I realized Mimi was crying for me. And so, nearly 60 years later, never having seen her again, I dreamt of her daughter grabbing my coat at a gathering of a family who are all dead now. But that is also a seemingly unending pastoral gathering of joy and music. When I ask myself how much of this is true, I have to laugh. When I ask myself what it means, I have to nearly cry. The memory that became the poem shifted its weight and became images in a dream. And somehow I think of Shakespeare's sonnet, "In me thou seest the glowing of such fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the dead end, as the deathbed whereon it must expire." Dead end. Whoa. As the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. Shakespeare perfectly captures not life, not death, but an impossibly precise moment in which the two smolder together, in which, staring into the images in our own fire, we see a kind of totality in a symbol, a life in a dream. After I had gathered the idea of talking about this dream and this poem, I looked it up because I couldn't remember the title. It's A Man's Game. It doesn't refer just to the game of stretch or to the game of human intimacy, but more than anything else I've written, to the playfulness that one should embrace as a poet, say, or as a teacher. I remember the night I wrote it, how after rushing it out, I sat looking at it and was stunned to see that all but 3 of its lines had rhymed themselves without any help from me. Marsupio connubial, anybody? Like the wonder of staring into a fire for answers, or reading one's own dreams or one's poems, or grabbing somebody you really like and playing a game of stretch. There's a certain call and response energy that is most pronounced when you realize that you've told a story you didn't know you were telling. It's a point where gaming takes over and you learn to trust it. If you're a teacher or a poet, to my mind, this inevitably means that these strange pleasures don't really come in solitude. That a poet's solitude, a teacher's loneliness, are actually illusions. Poetry and teaching are a summoning to co-presence, like sex, or like any game in which one's opponent becomes one's partner. In such a game one doesn't want to win, because that would end it. I think I see a strange combination of mastery and surrender. Call it a poetics based on the principle of oppositional partnership, although that leaves out almost everything that matters. Or call it simply a poetics of stretch. I urge you all to go out right now and grab a jackknife and a partner. Thanks. That was from Mimi, wherever she may be, and for Judith, who's out there.
All right, but don't go get your jackknife right now. It's Christine's turn to speak.
First, I'd like to thank Diana Stetto, head of the English department, for the time and enthusiasm with which she's planned this event, and also the excellent interview that she gave on KRBS this week about this panel. And also thanks to the College of Liberal Arts for their support of this I'd like to take just a moment to mention and remember Dr. Martha Reed, who was a poet, author of 5 books, and who directed a creative writing program here at UL for several years, leaving us in 2013. She died suddenly last week. She was scheduled to read at New Orleans Poetry Festival this weekend, and I gather that the festival is now being dedicated to her memory. Our thoughts go out to her family. Our inimitable department head, Diana Stetko, asked us to talk about what keeps us fresh after doing what we do for all these years, what keeps us passionate day in, day out, as we head off to our respective classrooms full of students who perhaps want to be there or perhaps they don't, but who in the end can teach and inspire us and make us laugh. I've not been in the profession, as you gathered, as long as my respected colleagues here. For me, it's been only 17 short years. This was my second career. And this job at UL was my first job out of graduate school. And if I may, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about how I got here. My husband and I owned a small advertising agency in Chicago, and I joined, just for fun, a writers group at my local library. And it was there that I started to write on a more regular basis. That group was run by a wonderful woman named Maxine. She was in her 70s, blonde as blonde could be, with a giant curl that swung over her face at every move of her head. She wasn't a brilliant critic and knew nothing about getting published, but her encouragement and her conviction that writing was worth doing no matter the quality, no matter the topic, helped to validate my own conviction. Believe me, we had some boring, exasperating, and squirmily erotic writing in that group, as well as some excellent writing. We were a motley collection of characters, none of whom, including myself, was headed towards writing stardom. But we all held the same conviction about the value of writing, and were all equally encouraged and pushed on by our heroic blonde leader, Maxine. That little local library group inspired me to go to various one-time seminars on writing taught by professors from English departments at some of the local colleges, and I suddenly had an epiphany of sorts. I realized that one could actually earn a living by reading and talking and writing about literature. So when the vicissitudes of the business world meant that our small ad agency was no longer viable in the form that it had existed for some years, my husband decided to retire, and I decided to go to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And when I graduated 6 years later, I ended up applying for this job at UL, and that was 17 years ago. I came to this country in 1973, and I'm planning on moving back to the UK this summer once I've retired, and contemplating that move has made me look back over the time I've taken, the time I've been here in the States, and much has happened, obviously, since I moved here. I've earned 4 college degrees. I've learned to count my weight in pounds instead of stones. Sounds a lot better to say I weigh 10 stone than 140 pounds. I learned that boots and bonnets are not part of my car, and that pants are trousers, not underwear. I've learned that a toad in the hole and spotted dick don't seem to be appetizing dishes here, even though I've been willing to eat alligator at times. In this country, I learned to practice yoga. I've had the privilege of living with 7 extraordinary dogs, 4 Yorkies and 3 golden retrievers. Luckily, not all at the same time. I got divorced, and then I got married again, and then I was widowed. I have received 2 new knees since I've been here, in this case, literal joints that have renewed my body and spirit. In this country and here at UL, I've met some of the people who've touched my heart and blown my mind because they're so talented. And I've made friends that will be my friends forever. It was in this country that I found my love of academia. I found my love of teaching and writing. And this takes me back to Diana's question about what keeps us passionate. And I found that no matter my mood, no matter what's happening in my life, teaching can raise my spirits, and students can renew my enthusiasm for well-trodden literary texts and can help me appreciate unfamiliar ones. Just last week in my class, students made me laugh so hard I was crying. This week in one of my classes, we were reading a Bernard Shaw play called Mrs. Warren's Profession, and a student who works at Acadiana Cares thought it an appropriate moment to bring a bag of free condoms to hand out in class. We read Azar Nafisi's memoir, Reading Lolita in Tehran, in my class this semester, and one student came up to me after class, a smile on her face, her eyes shining, and told me it was the best thing she'd read in a long time. One never knows what will happen in an English class, which is, of course, part of the attraction. For example, here's what one of my students in my sophomore level class wrote to me this semester about taking English classes. She says, I like to be able to look at a text and say, so this is what's going on here, and then dig deeper, find more, learn more. That's what I believe English is all about, digging deeper, finding more. It never is just about what appears on the surface. Additionally, the texts we read speak to the universal struggle of the human spirit. And she goes on, some days I'm not sure what I'm doing, but I know I'm where I'm supposed to be, and this is largely due to my professors. I was having dinner last week with Marianne at Carruthers on Wednesday evening, and we happened to run into a student of hers that I don't know how long ago he'd taken your class, but remembered what an amazing class he'd had with Marianne, and talked about the fact that he was planning on applying to graduate school, partly inspired by the fact that he'd enjoyed Marianne's class so much. But why go to graduate school? How is the study of literature relevant today? Diana asked me about the piece I wrote that's included in the small brochure that's handed out today, and asked if it was fiction or nonfiction. It's about a murder, and I explained that it indeed was nonfiction, and that I grew up in a, well, one might say a rather gritty part of London. This is part of the reason that my first book was on social class in late 19th century British literature. I wanted to understand not just the history of the class system in England, but how it had affected people within it. My last book was a collection of essays about 19th century British writers who came to the New World, and you can see why that topic too might have been of interest to me. Dickens, for example, came to America in 1842, and his reception here was almost like that of the Beatles. People swarmed around him. But having been excited about the democratic experiment he was coming to visit because he loved the notion of equality, once people he considered beneath him felt the right to just sort of walk up and talk to him on the street or on the train, he realized that equality wasn't quite what he'd expected. This is not the America of my imagination, he said disdainfully. I, of course, came here partly with a view to getting away from that British class system. So you see, the texts I've studied and written about, 19th century texts though they were, have always seemed very relevant to me. I think about Dorothy Wordsworth writing in her journal in the early 1900s, complaining about her brother William wasting his mind in the magazines. What would she have thought of Facebook or Twitter, one wonders? But I feel sure that Dickens and Wordsworth would have enjoyed both of them. But while literature is relevant to our lives, Azir Nafisi, teaching British and American literature in Tehran during the Fundamentalist Revolution, tells her students, do not, under any circumstances, belittle a work of fiction by trying to turn it into a carbon copy of life. What we search for in fiction is not so much reality, but the epiphany of truth. As my three colleagues and I hold hands and walk off into the sunset at the end of this semester, I'll be thinking about what will happen in the future to the English department here at UL as it takes in new, young scholars and writers that help to shape the department in different ways. And I'll be wondering what will happen to our discipline in these times when the humanities are under attack and STEM seems to be the watchword of the moment. Why should we be reading 19th century texts and older ones? What am I teaching when I teach literature classes? Am I teaching close reading skills, writing skills? Am I teaching literary history, author biography? Am I teaching cultural history, cultural context, critical theory, or all of the above? Some say we're teaching how to be human or what it means to be human, but that's not something one can put on a syllabus or test in a quiz, but it happens nonetheless. George Eliot felt that reading fiction helped us to develop what she called fellow feeling, in other words, empathy for others. As we move away from being the traditional English department that is organized simply by literary period and divided by concentration, a paradigm that doesn't really make sense anymore, our discipline seems as though it's becoming more dispersed, less focused. And we need to be sure, my young colleagues and our graduate students need to be sure that we know why we're doing what we're doing, and we need to be able to communicate that to the world at large. I'd like to ask my three colleagues here, and perhaps even the audience, where they see the discipline headed at this juncture. But before I do, I'd like to read this quotation from John Kennedy, who seemed to have a vision of the value of the arts even back in the 60s. He says, "The artist, however faithful to his personal vision of reality, becomes the last champion of the individual mind and sensibility against an intrusive society and an officious state. But in pursuing his perceptions of reality, he must often sail against the currents of his time. If sometimes our great artists have been the most critical of our society, it is because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. I see little of more importance to the future of our country," he says, "and our civilization than full recognition of the place of the artist. If art is to nourish the roots of our culture, society must set the artist free to follow his vision wherever it takes him. We must never forget that art is not a form of propaganda, it is a form of truth." So says John F. Kennedy. Thank you.
So, would anyone like to begin by answering Christine's question?
You know, I think the barbarians have crashed the gates, but I think that's not all bad. I think the English departments have become more diffuse, as you say, more responsive to the changing audiences that we have, less ethereal about art with a capital A, more vocational. I think that's kind of necessary today. But I think there's still a central core to what we do and how we profess literature. I just think there's a lot more diversity and variety in how we allow ourselves to do that.
When I was listening to Marianne earlier, one of the things that really resonated for me, can you hear me all right without the mic? Was that your sort of pre-feminist experience is not a disadvantage for you. That actually, having lived as long as we have, I mean, I remember as a 12-year-old reading about freedom rides, reading about the civil rights movement, and so for me, the academy, change happens all the time and constantly, and it can be retrograde as well as progressive. And so it feels to me like there's just an advantage in having people like Marianne, people like Skip, who can look at all of the change that's going on in an academy and university and say, and not just say that it's good for its own sake, but rather that it's speaking to the complexity of the changing community that's coming through it.
I have not much to add, except that I sort of pull back and agree at the same time. I'm afraid that English studies is being swallowed, as Jonathan was talking about just yesterday, by communications, or that cultural studies and cultural analysis is overcoming that which I have devoted my life to, that is literary studies. And I know how retrograde it is to think about, as Pound said, the study of literature as hero worship. It's terrible to worship such heroes as Pound in some ways, but in some ways not. So I think that would be I love the openness. I love that cultural studies has come into the play, but if it overcomes literature, I'm not as optimistic.
I'm going to invite the audience to say to join me in kind of the discussion a little bit, but just listening to the four of you, what was interesting is that when you are looking back at your careers, you're looking back on your lives, right? You're not separating your life from your career. And that seems to me what the liberal arts and the humanities and English is about, right? It's not just that you chose careers that allowed you to bring the personal and the political into the professional, but that's part of what we are doing as teachers. We often have to say, because students are taking on so much debt to go to college now, and politicians are worried more about, universities and what they do for jobs, and we don't ignore that, but we don't see that as separate from the other ways in which our students are preparing for their lives too. I don't know if that's how you saw it, but that's kind of how I saw you, listen to you talking about your life as you're going into retirement now. You weren't just talking about your careers, but you were never just, but you weren't, when talking about your lives, we're still talking about your careers and your profession as well.
Yeah, maybe the humanities causes us to be more holistic in the way we look at things, yeah.
That's not without risk either, right? I mean, one of the things, I think if you want to do some good, do it in minute particulars, William Blake said. And there's a sense in which we, year in, year out, having that forum of people to talk to and hearing our own ideas amplified in our heads, as we do it, that there's a risk of too much thinking globally and acting globally, that without the sense of self-critique. And for me, that's I've critiqued myself to the point where I don't want to do it anymore. I don't want to sort of have to listen to myself saying, hey, you're doing it wrong, or you haven't done enough. But that, I'm not sure that's a response to anything.
One of the benefits of teaching, I think, is that one feels that acts as a certain critique, right, that of our own ideas and our own modes of approaching what we teach, and that our students, in some ways, not confrontationally, but in the way that they approach their writing or approach discussion in class, change the way in which we approach things, actually shape our ideas.
And you get that self-critique every semester when you read your evaluations from your students, and that kind of self-referentiality which continues to happen every semester. And it sometimes really teaches you something about the way you perform in the classroom.
I thought I'd ask some of the ways in which our careers go, our lives go, takes us in weird directions. And I think one of the weirdest directions that Skip's career took him was into the Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky scandal. And I thought I'd like to have him tell that story.
Maybe I can summarize it rather quickly. It's rather boring if you don't remember Ken Starr and Lewinsky's dress and all of that. A graduate student came to me in January of 1998 with a copy of the New York Times, which had just published a document called The Talking Points, which was presumptively written by Clinton and or Clinton's men to suborn the perjury of a third party. Basically, the graduate student and I put that through deep analysis, textual analysis, bibliographical analysis, found out that there were 3 different versions, all purporting to be the exact wording of the original. Anyway, we put a large interrogation upon that document because we knew it was false. It wasn't written by Clinton or Clinton's men. That came out after the fact for certain because Clinton, in a deposition that was secret in February, had actually testified directly counter to what that document showed. But Kenneth Starr used that document as a way to get an extension of authority from the Whitewater affair to the Lewinsky affair. And so we were sparring with Starr through national news. We were on Burden of Proof on CNN. And I had things written about us in Boston Globe and New York Observer, places like that. We were on many radio interviews and coming out of the department, and probably slowed down Starr's indictment of Clinton by 3 weeks until he found out about the dress. We were off the table, and he never talked about the talking points again, even though that's how he got the extension of the authority, and that would have been a sure felony for Clinton and probably driven him out of office. I'm not saying we saved Clinton in office because it would have come out probably in trial that the world knew our own work. But anyway, we might have slowed down some historical momentum in July of 1998, 20 years ago.
Do people have some questions or comments that they would like to make? I have to have
There's
questions.
a quiz after this.
Well, I know, yes.
I would say so. Thank you all for all the contributions to the department and things you've done both individually and collectively. But I would say, are there things that you wish you hadn't done or things you would warn we have a variety of people at various stages of their career not to do. Looking back now, don't do that. I wish I hadn't done that. You can depersonalize it if you like.
I have, and I should have mentioned this in my 10 minutes, and I just didn't have time. I very much regret, in one sense, that I didn't do any administrative work in this department, that my colleagues have done. Graduate director and director of freshman English and creative writing director and things like that. I don't know if I would change it because I'm essentially pretty selfish in terms of my time and wanted to turn out my books, but that's my regret.
I imagine some of you regret that you did the interview.
You said that.
I would say I did not regret being graduate coordinator because I enjoyed it immensely. But you have to then accept the fact that you don't have the time to do other things like your research and your writing.
Ultimately, there's a trade-off you've got to be willing to make.
It's a trade-off, but it's rewarding in other ways. It's not as though I didn't feel as though I was giving up something. I felt like I was just changing direction.
Yeah, I felt that way when I coordinated the humanities program, that it was valuable work, and I learned about what's going on in other departments outside the narrow walls of English, and that's so important because we don't talk to each other enough, I think. But after 4 years, I was ready to step down. Yeah.
Skip, you talked about how your reading really was so fundamental to your art. And I know, Jerry, you were going to, that kind of gets into a little bit of what you were getting in, maybe.
I don't know. I mean, there are technical questions that I'm interested in terms of, I think the way the profession has become in some ways expressionistic. That's to say, it's rewarding a certain dumbness or completeness to textuality rather than thinking about readership in some ways. So that's like I said, kind of technical matter that I'm not sure anybody wants to hear about. Was there something particular?
No,
Specific?
I told them to talk about whatever they want, and I take the responsibility for the coherence of this.
I want to come back to your previous question about advice or things to do. One of the things I did was to find somebody I admired in the department and watch them. And I remember one particular male role model that I admired so much because he knew how to run a meeting. He was totally focused and organized and aggressive in the good way and in control. And I thought, okay, I want to do that.
Were you married to him in the
I want to be that. And then there was a female role model too in our department who was very generous with her time and very interested in my work. And if you can find somebody like that, and if you're not too proud to emulate someone else, I think that's a good plan to have.
So, the two women on this panel have been great mentors to me, and no offense, Jerry, if I don't know you guys as well, I haven't had the opportunity, perhaps because you didn't do administration, but you just talked about finding people that you admire, but what about mentorship? Because you have done it so well, and I know that Skip and Jerry, you have done it incredibly well also, from the acknowledgments that I read in dissertation in particular.
What
Can
I
you
should
talk
say,
about
one of my colleagues in graduate school at Enroll, Michael Chamberlain, I think it was, wrote an article early in her career titled, "How many graduate students can I hold to my breast?" The idea of the woman as the sort of dedicated mentor and designated, paternal or maternal figure in the department. I wonder.
That's not without its pitfalls.
I wonder what you think about that.
I don't know. I don't like to tap into those stereotypes about women being nurturing and maternal, but I think that that's a model that is often used in a mentoring scenario, and I've certainly enjoyed mentoring the women's studies graduate students that I've worked with and watching them have their first teaching experiences in a very difficult, unruly group of students sometimes because they're from all different majors. And they present a challenge. But yeah, I would say tough love is a good way to be a mentor too, not completely maternal, but critiquing their teaching style and their persona in the classroom. I find that very valuable, and I think they have too.
Yes, Clancy.
I was thinking, you're retiring and you can say anything you want. Ask me about something that is maybe a little sensitive and controversial. I mean, when I talk about it, I feel that way. But you have all taught a lot of general education courses, 100 and 200 level various courses. And I think you're well positioned to talk about the value of that experience on this campus in a time when those courses are being migrated to the high schools for dual enrollment. And there's so many people there's so much of a push to allow more testing out and automatic test score credit for these courses. They are, a lot of first-year writing courses are being offered in high schools. We're having, higher enrollments, but lower numbers of sections of first-year writing classes. Our sections of first-year writing offered through this university that are taught in high schools, the number of sections has increased over 500% since I got here in 2007. And, it's, I don't know, I mean, to critique that, it can, you can be made to feel like you're the enemy of progress, But I mean, I want to hear from you and your perspectives about the value of that time and that experience in college. Those courses taught on a college campus in your experience. And I don't know, anything you have to say about that?
Well, what I have to say is that you're probably the best authority in this room for talking about it. I'd like to hear more of what you have to say.
Just anecdotally from teaching 115s, for example, the honors first year classes, and 215, I would say that students have a real transition to go through as they come into college, and if they take those classes in high school, then they're not getting the benefit of doing that transition in situ, as it were, and really gaining that experience early on and figuring out what it means to be a college student instead of a high school student, and they find out a big difference.
Right. There's something about sitting around that seminar table, I think in a 115 to 16, which are the classes I've taught, that's just categorically different from sitting on a high school campus and taking those same classes. They bond. These students continue their friendships throughout the 4 years of college, and I think that's a very important phenomenon that happens only on a college campus.
I wonder, talking about mentorship and mentoring, the extent to which you choose the people you mentor, and the extent to which you seek out people who gratify you personally and who can sort of give back, and in whom you recognize something really powerful. And there feels almost to me like a dissonance. I love that kind of relationship. But I don't love teaching 102 or 106, or 206 rather. And it seems to me that there are people here like you and like Jack Burstel who have done spectacular work in that area, whereas, in all honesty, I've spent my career looking for people I thought I could mentor to go to graduate school or were already in graduate school, and so in some ways ducked those very classes.
And I've taught, as Mary Ann has, the honors freshman and honors sophomore, the American literature. And I love those courses, I absolutely do. I'll have students that I've heard them walk out last week or so and said, I've never missed this class, because they just loved it so much. The interaction with each other, they're smart people. It's not 102 and 206. I mean, it's a different sort of population. But they're intelligent, even if they're not English majors, and intelligence generally loves intelligence. And so if you can create an environment in which there's a lot of good things going on. I've met so many students who I still have relationships with, young poets, Kim Vodka and Jacqueline Frost, Jack Frost. They're great classes. The magic of the classroom, I think, happens especially at those lower division classes.
I do too. I don't know what you can do to stop what's happening, but certainly I can vouch for the experiences in those kinds of classes.
One of the most exciting things for me as a graduate student here has been getting the opportunity to design my own class, and y'all have like a lifetime of those experiences behind you. So I was wondering if each of you had a favorite class that you've designed during your time at any level that just is memorable, that you're really happy that you got to put together.
There's so many.
More than one's fine too.
I love the seminar I'm teaching this semester, Spectral America, Phantoms in the American Literary Imagination, which is an early American lit seminar, and we talk about the concept of haunting and hauntings, starting with the Salem witch trials and going all the way to Edith Wharton's ghost stories. And it's been wonderful. I've taught a class on New Orleans in the humanities program. And we had a unit on food. What's not to love about that, right? So many.
I think of two classes. One of them was called Gunfighters and Girls, where we looked at American mythology through the lens of Richard Slotkin's treatments of American myth. But Slotkin basically exclusively paid attention to sort of a mythology of maleness, and what I was trying to do was split it in half and look at first his Gunfighter Nation, and then with that kind of model in mind, look to see what kind of models of femininity or models of mythology for women there might have been. That was a really exciting class. The other one for me is the play shop I'm running right now, where I cast aside the old idea of the workshop in order to focus on how play features in our creative lives. And what I wanted to say, and this is the first thing that crossed my mind when we talked about having this panel, I want to give you one more quotation. It's by a guy I ordinarily wouldn't quote at all, George Shultz, explaining why he went to Ronald Reagan and explained that Iran-Contra was going to hurt him. He said, you can't want the job too much. We're in a position where we don't have to want the job anymore. And there's a sense in which we act, I don't know, I don't think Skip ever got tired of teaching, or Christine, and I feel like Marianne and I got a little extra jump this semester. I felt certainly that I did. Just this sense of being able to say, I'm going to do this class, whether it if it kills me. Do that now. Do that before you're a relic.
These guys, what is it about guys and getting older, huh? Okay, they're just veers to the...
Relic
To the
Arcade.
decrepitude, yeah. My courses have been a little bit more traditional. One of the great things of this job, as most of you already know, that if you want to investigate, say, protest literature in the first half of the 20th century, you can propose that for a year away and spend the next year prepping that class and getting involved with that. So I've been involved with women poets or confessional poets or Pound and Williams. We had one seminar in Creeley in which we, Robert Creeley, which Jerry and I shared, in which we called Creeley at the end of the class, and each member had a number of questions that we asked, and but they're pretty traditional compared to somebody like Jerry.
One of my favorite classes was the scary and the scandalous in 19th century British literature. And what we found out was they turn out to be the same thing. But I'm guessing that one of your favorite classes when you're retiring, you'll look back and think of Hamilton as one of your favorite classes, probably, right?
I loved our Gilded Age class too, Kim. That was a good group. And sometimes it's not what you're teaching, it's who you're teaching that makes the class so magical.
And sing?
What are you going to reread after this semester, but not for teaching?
What?
What are you going to reread after this semester, but not for teaching?
I want to read Gaudy Night, Young Sing.
Stole it from me.
What was that, Kristen?
Gaudy Night. Young Sing once told me she reads it every year. Do you still do that?
Every summer I reread Gaudy Night. Makes me cry. I like to
Okay,
cry.
I'm going to read Middlemarch for the first time. I'm sorry, I have to confess. I know all about the ideas.
How about if I confess that I'm not going to read Middlemarch?
I never could plow through it.
I'm going to read Interpretation of Dreams again and finish Tristram Shandy.
I'd just like to signify, if you may, we had a graduate student here called Kevin
Mobley?
Mobley, who he had been in my class where we read Middlemarch. At least they said they did. Who knows? He went to a Halloween party that semester with a book, made up a book on his head with blood running down the book, and of course on the spine of the book was Middlemarch. Sorry.
No, I have done that. It used to be I would read Ezra Pound's cantos once a year. That's when I was working at mental hospitals on the night shift. Then it was about once every 5 years or so. But that's one book I'll continually reread because it's just so poetically rich. But then dozens of other poets, including Proust, and I just have piles and piles. I'm moving my library from my office right now and having one built in my guest room. So don't come and visit me because there'll be nowhere to stay. But yeah, dozens of books.
Did I see? Yes.
I've been retired for 2 years now, and Jerry brought up dreams. And a strange thing has been happening to me in that I've been dreaming about teaching a lot, and the dreams are not always bad. I mean, I guess Freud might have had a point that dreams are expressions of wish. Maybe I do wish I was teaching again. Maybe. But when I was teaching, I had a lot of teachers' nightmares. Do you all have those kinds of bad dreams, like, where a student hates your guts? I mean, that happened in reality too, but or you couldn't come up with an explanation or something, and that too happened in reality sometimes. But I had a lot of teachers' nightmares when I was teaching. Now I have a lot of, I guess, wish fulfillment dreams. I don't know. They're always good dreams. So maybe, well, I guess my question is, do you all have such dreams? Do you dream about teaching? And if so, are they bad?
I dream about not being prepared for class because I'm such a little Catholic school girl. I do my homework and I wake up sometimes and I think, you didn't bring your book and you didn't read your assignment. So that's my nightmare.
Yeah.
I guess I've had touches of that, and also that I'm 50 miles away from the classroom and I'm supposed to be there in 10 minutes. But not significantly.
Felicia?
I just want to say I had a narrow perspective of English when I started in the English department, and now I have an open mind, and I had no idea that English could be so diverse and interesting and culturally relevant, and thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll echo that. Thank you. It's been really wonderful to come here and to see the 4 ways in which you all model this academic life. But one question I had, noticing you all speak so much about passions that you had, but also the amount of work that you all did, and a lot of work probably outside of normal working hours, in addition to teaching and doing administrative duties. So my question is, in terms of thinking about mentoring graduate students, thinking about balancing my own life, if you all had habits that you got into in order to accomplish all that you accomplished, while also doing all the work that you did for UL.
Well, that's a hard question.
The principal one for me was because so much of my writing involves dream, cultivating a capacity to continue writing while I'm dreaming. That's to say, to work text through while I'm still asleep and not lose it. Get up and do it.
Wake up early. I'm a morning person. 5:30 or 6. My most productive time to write and think is about 7 a.m. to 1 in the afternoon. And then I just start. So those of you who've had night classes with me, I managed to wake up for those.
I got all my work done while I was sleeping.
I'm also 4 to 7 is basically my time, and it's always been easy. It's easier as the older you get, basically you start going to bed at 8 o'clock or something like that. But when Jim was sort of asking us what we wanted to talk about, I thought that one of the sort of backgrounds of my work is to try to show that a lifetime of serious production can be incredibly gratifying. It might keep you from doing other things that you're supposed to do, but I would tell young faculty and graduate students to start really enjoying it now, because then it can be a lifetime of great pleasure and great reward.
You know, I think that one of the, well, it's sort of bad news, Sadie, actually, that there is no trick to it, right? That work just continues to sort of be part of your whole life, day and night, weekends as well, and there really is no real separation there, which I think is one of the things you noticed, Jim, as we were talking about our lives and our work. But as Skip says, if you love that work and if you enjoy what you're doing, then that just becomes a part of your life, and you don't see it as a separate thing. It just becomes part of you.
People who can't do that aren't going to wind up at this table. They're going to fun. They're going to go start advertising agencies.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, that kind of brings me back to the mentoring issue, because I've been doing some reading about that, particularly mentoring in composition studies, and most of the work written on that subject is by women, and part of it is that women scholars have said it was very difficult, if not impossible, for them to find mentors when before there were many women in the profession. That was when you look at the careers of people of our generation and the generation before, this was a huge problem. A second was that women in academia, their mentoring often has to be, or at least they believe, right, has to be about more than just their scholarship, right? It's
Yes.
often about
Right.
balancing, finding a life and balancing in the politics and the sexual harassment can, in a way that's much bigger than that. And I thought that might be something worth commenting on, but I also think that the mentoring of creative writing students seemed to me from the outside different from the mentoring that you're doing with other students as well. That our mentoring experiences probably are different because of what we're mentoring and who we are.
It's like herding kittens and butterflies in the same room. Skip can speak to that better than I can. He's mentored more writers in this place than anybody ever will again.
Well, probably not, but I have found that you're not just, with a writer, you're not just mentoring them. Basically, a lot of my work is just, have you read this, have you read that, pulling stuff off of my shelves and loaning it to them, and being willing to talk about something. But it's also, with a young poet especially, and maybe it's just me, what's interesting to them is it's everything you're thinking about, your life, the way you think about economics or anything, right? It's not just in terms of a canon or certain people to read. So it's, they're looking for, maybe they're doing that hero worship too, right? And looking into a deeper insight and a holistic insight into their life, as well as contemporary poets.
Can I just go back to Sadie's question, actually, and your comment on mentoring, women mentoring, and that is I think it's particularly important for women to not throw themselves into that kind of maternal mode, and recognize that those students are, or young faculty as it may be, are professionals and have to take responsibility for their own work and their own lives, and that we can't fix everything for them, which is part of the temptation that we have. And I think, Sadie, that in that sense, it's a way of saving yourself time and emotional energy by not wanting to do everything that you think that you might be able to do for a student.
You can be a good teacher and a good mentor without being a mommy or a daddy.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah.
Mary Ann said.
Absolutely. At some point, you gotta be a judge.
My
And you've gotta say, that wasn't good.
My
You didn't
predicament.
do that right. Yeah.
My predicament has always been that every time I find a student who is ripe for mentoring, they've already been to Skip.
That's not true.
Let's skip to it.
Micah Ballard is the exception to that. He started off with Jerry.
I'll say something about, when I was a young faculty member, a lot of the women, and there weren't that many in the profession at that time, older women, they weren't into mentoring so much. They were so happy they had made it up the ladder that they just weren't very connected to that whole mentoring model. And so we kind of had to flounder. I remember in graduate school, I had a tall British woman who taught Victorian literature, and I went to her office once, and it was not her office hours, and she chased me away and said, please come back during my office hours. And I thought, oh, is this the model I have, you know, for humane scholarship? And so a lot of the models, some of the models were negative models during that time period. I would say too, though, for those of you interested in writing grants, there's a lot of money out there in mentorship programs, grant money. And I've often thought about starting, you know, earlier in my career, writing a grant for a mentoring program across campus.
You do remind me of a story of one of my professors who had F.O. Matheson as his advisor. And Matheson's office was in the stacks of the Harvard Library. So you had to get a stack pass in order to meet with him. We're getting close to the end of the time. I don't know if we have any, are there any questions or comments people would want to make? Any closing comments?
I'd like to mention Martha Reed again. This was sort of a tragic death that happened about a week ago. She had a sudden stroke. She's in her mid-40s. Some of my best memories of...
59.
59, I didn't know that. Anyway, where Martha and I talk about mentoring, we used to go to Baton Rouge or New Orleans once a month or so for readings, and we'd take graduate students along. I know that Rhonda went at least once, and we'd go to the Gold Mine Saloon or to one of the other reading venues. And that was a great time. And those trips itself, I mean, all of us have done that kind of thing, but I just want to mention Martha in that context.
Okay, there's a former professor of mine from my undergraduate years, who I'm friends with on Facebook now, and she recently posted a photograph taken in maybe 1992, and it was a group photo of everybody in the English department at that time, and it was just, I mean, so many people like flooded this post with comments and, you know, really warm memories and everything. And so I would really like, no pressure, if you don't want to, that's okay, but I would like for us to have a group photograph for the future. You know, like, so anybody who wants to, you know, please stick around for a group photo. I'm sure I can find somebody to take the photo. I've got the camera here. We can take pictures with phones, but I would like to do that after this. Everybody's okay with that.
Sure, that's a great idea.
Okay. Well, I think our panel has earned their last paycheck. And we'd like to thank you all for coming. It was a great discussion, and I know we have refreshments after this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
The preceding program was made possible in part with production assistance provided by AOC Community Media.